I'm going to turn you around, Mark, to meet the fans. Hello.
Was that it?
Perfect.
I missed it.
Can you hear me all right, Mark?
I can hear you. How do I sound?
Great.
Okay, good. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me and being flexible as well.
Absolutely. Life is strange and wonderful sometimes. So I wanted to open this talk by sort of just asking you both to talk a little bit about how did this book come to be? What was the first spark for this piece of work?
So this is the first time Mark and I have done it this way, so it will be experiment. But thank you, Shady, and thank you to Lost City Books. But I was writing. I was a TV editor at Variety, which is a publication that covers TV, film, music, stage. And this was in the early '90s when there's big news that David Lynch was coming to TV with a new show called Twin Peaks, and the thing was just, you who are old enough to remember that broadcast TV was under tremendous pressure from cable, which had started getting original programming, and believe it or not, something called VCRs. And so there was all this competition for viewers, and ABC was in the last place. And it was true that the last place network would be the most in terms of taking chances. So they were the ones who bet on Mark Frost and David Lynch. The thing that was, so we were writing stories about this every week. David Lynch is coming to TV, but the thing I was kind of curious about or so interesting about it was that ABC was so afraid. They had seen it. They'd seen the pilot. They were so afraid of how people were going to respond to this that they kept postponing. They kept delaying coming up with a premiere date for the show. And Mark Frost and David Lynch got kind of ticked off about it, and they kind of launched this guerrilla campaign by holding screenings of the show for press in several different venues to get word of mouth, to get ABC to put this on the air. And finally, ABC did, and so I was, I was a big fan of the show, but I also had this sort of professional interest in it at the time. Flash forward many years later, and I was writing a book called Twin Peaks FAQ, and it was right around the time they announced that season 3 was coming back on Showtime, and which is really why Hal Leonard approved the green lighted the book. So in that, while researching that book, this book was supposed to be everything you ever wanted to know about Twin Peaks. We came across a quote by Mark Frost, who was co-creator of the show with David Lynch, that his contribution to the eruptive arc of the show, which was the death of this 19-year-old, I think she was 19, thereabouts, a teenage young woman from a small town called Twin Peaks in the state of Washington. She's her body. The first thing that happens in the show is her body turns up on the lake. It's found by a lumberjack there, and she's wrapped in plastic. And the whole first season and a half of the show is devoted to finding out who killed her, and it goes off in weird directions. And so Mark Frost had made a retrospective of the show, had made a comment to the effect that his contribution to the Laura Palmer, her name was Laura Palmer, that arc was inspired by two things. One was the death of, when he lived in California as a kid, his family had close friends that, this may be my next book. His family had close friends who, he was very close friends with a kid, a boy, his own age. And they had an older sister who went upstate somewhere to camp, sleepaway camp. And while she was up there, she was murdered. And the parents went up to get the body. This has nothing to do with the book that I'm about to talk about, but they went up to get the body, and Mark knew about it and Scott knew about it, but they were told by their parents, because the kids, the brothers of this young woman who was killed, stayed with the Frost that weekend. And Mark and his brother Scott were said, don't say anything to this to your friends. So that was one half of his inspiration. The other half was basically the story that brings us here, which is the story of a woman named Hazel Drew, whom Mark Frost referred to as Hazel Gray, unfortunately, which caused Mark Givens and I a lot of heartache in terms of tracking it down. But she was a young woman, was killed in upstate New York in a town called Sand Lake around the turn of the century. Her body was found in a pond. That's basically all we knew. Frost's grandmother had a house in the area, and Mark and Scott, his brother, who also wrote for Twin Peaks, would spend summers there. And their grandmother used to tell them the story in order to scare them into coming home at night, not staying out too late. She would say to them, the woods are haunted by the ghost of this young woman who had been murdered, and her murderer had never been caught. So that was all Mark really knew about it. And like I said, he gave us a bunch of either wrong or very vague information that Mark Givens and I then had to track down. But it was so intriguing. And unfortunately, I had so little time to devote to it in the book that I was writing, Twin Peaks FAQ. So I didn't. But I made a note to myself, let's check this out later. Meanwhile, I was listening to Mark Givens' podcast called Dear Meta Radio at www.dearmetaradio.com. And he had devoted an entire episode to it. And it was a really good episode. He was really kind of digging into the weeds. And I said, why don't I reach out to Mark and see if he would be interested in writing a book? And I guess Mark can take it from there.
Yeah, so can everybody see me and hear me? Just, I don't know what's going on. Okay, all I can see is David. Okay, I'll talk to David. David covered a lot of ground there. He even went off script with the anecdote about Mark Frost a little bit. So in terms of background, I think that covered it. I was also a big Twin Peaks fan from back in the day. I was just in high school at the time, so it just really struck me. If you've seen it or hasn't seen it, it doesn't matter for the book, but if you are a fan of Twin Peaks, I think that's a bonus, for the book, because I think, as David laid out, it's the starting point for Twin Peaks. But if you know anything about Twin Peaks or David Lynch, then it gets into, the little man dancing in his dream, and that has nothing to do with our story. There's no supernatural killers or anything. But yeah, so initially I was, Twin Peaks came back a few years ago, probably 5 years ago now. And at that time, David was working on his book, and I was working on a podcast, just messing around. And that's kind of the podcast I do. I used to I'm sad I'm not there tonight, because I actually lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, worked as a consultant for the government, and now I live in Broomall, Pennsylvania, but picked up research skills, and so kind of applied that to my podcast about Twin Peaks. And that's how I similarly uncovered the story of Hazel Drew. And once you, like he said, David said, it took a while to even find Hazel Drew, because Mark Frost got the name wrong. But once we uncovered it, it was like, the OJ case of 1908. It was in all the headlines and the Post and the New York Times and all across the country for about 2.5 weeks. So yeah, that was that was just one episode I was doing on the podcast, but it kind of overtook. I don't do the podcast anymore because the book kind of took all our energy. It was such a interesting story. Is similar to Twin Peaks in that regard, that if you like, this is called true crime because true crime is like the big seller right now. But as we've been doing these talks, I do find this one is, it's more, I think I heard people talking a little bit before the event started about the mystery aspect. And that's what this is. It was unsolved, and there's all kinds of suspects and theories and red herrings. So if you like that kind of thing, if you like Twin Peaks, or if you don't like David Lynch, that doesn't really matter. If you just like a good story that kind of twists and turns, I think you would enjoy this book. So that's kind of the intro background.
Absolutely, thank you. So my next question is about the research involved in looking into a century-old murder. And I imagine there was a lot, as you mentioned, twists and turns, Mark. So can you tell me, where did you start with the research, and what was the journey that you took that got you all the information for this book?
Yeah, so exactly. We started, like I said, with the newspaper articles. And you go to the newspapers.com, there's different tools on the internet. Now it's amazing, you can find these things without having to visit not always having to visit the library. We did have to go up to the Troy Library several times for certain papers that weren't online. But really, that was the basis of everything. The newspapers, like I said, it was a very high profile case for 2.5 weeks. And the fact that it was covered by so many different newspapers, it was kind of like, the Gospels in the Bible, where you get 4 different accounts of Jesus. You would get different biases and perspectives and new facts depending on what source you found. So it was a big jigsaw puzzle. Often newspapers would seemingly contradict each other. We'd have these that doesn't make any sense. To the point we had to kind of go back and start researching the newspapers to see, who was credible. A big thing we found out was, by talking to historians at the time, was that this was a very partisan area, especially up here in Troy, New York. So politics was everywhere. It's Republican, Democrats. It's not Republican. It's not the same parties of today. But we found out that there were Republican newspapers, basically, Democrat newspapers, and some of the characters in our case, I don't know if I'm leaping ahead here, but the investigators and some of the characters, because politics was everything up there, were affiliated with one party, and that did kind of become relevant. So that was but to take a step back to the research, the newspapers was a starting point, and I could probably hand it off to David here, but I would say as a lead-in, or if he's thinking of something else, but I alluded to, we went up to the library up there in Troy and Sand Lake, and made good time up there with the newspapers and the Historical Society. But more importantly, we met, it's like a community up there of locals who are interested in this. There's 2 in particular, and then I can hand it off to David. But Bob Moore is the historian in Sand Lake, and he was the first guy I reached out to, I think even before David and I spoke. And he was just, very enthusiastic about this, and just always more of like a people person. He had grown up in the area and would just connect us with, descendants of people involved in the case. We'd have these round tables, almost like quarterly, where we would sit around and just kind of for a couple hours just discuss various aspects. And then the other guy was Mark Marshall, and I'll hand it off because I need a sip of coffee. Do you want to discuss Mark Marshall, David? Can you hear me?
Well, yeah, but let me sort of back into that. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting to me about this experience was that if there are any of you out there are interested in writing books, I would urge you to keep this in mind. What you do is you send out, we knew this was an unsolved murder, and that our intention from the very beginning was to propose a solution. And obviously, we were going to have no witnesses. We were going to have no DNA, which didn't even exist as a concept at the time. We were going to have no fingerprints. We soon found out that we were going to have no, article, like none of our clothing was around anymore. All this stuff had been destroyed. Once we went to the county clerk's office and we asked for coroner's reports. And the guy comes back with like this box full of coroner reports. And we go, I'll bet you there's nothing here as far back as 1908. And we start combing through it and we see 1898 and we get like really excited. Well, guess what year is totally missing is 1908. So we had nothing. So we had to sort of figure this out ourselves. But what was interesting to me was, you send out query letters to all these publishers and agents and so on. And some of them came back to me and said, we don't publish books about unsolved murders. And I'm thinking, well, have you heard of the Black Dahlia? Have you heard about Jack the Ripper? And so this annoyed me to the point where I actually wound up starting a publishing company with a colleague of mine where, I was just so annoyed by this kind of thinking. So anyway, we knew we were going to have to. We knew we were going to have to propose some solution. And I've talked to people. Some people, it was like Book List or Publishers Weekly, who gave us a really good review, and then they said at the end, like, you may or may not agree with their findings. Like, we know not everybody's going to agree with our findings, but we go through the case and to the best of our ability, propose a solution that I think is pretty credible. And I think that was really the hardest thing about the research, was knowing that we were going to have to come up with a solution of some kind, because otherwise people would not feel satisfied. And how are we going to do that within the limitations of what we had? And all those things are talked about: the newspapers, the roundtables, the conversations with the descendants. We talked to Hazel Drew. She was a very mysterious character. Her body was found on a Saturday, which I think was July 8th. On the Friday of the week before, she went to her dressmakers, which, to begin with, if you're a housekeeper making $4.50 a week, how do you even afford to have a dress keeper? She also was said to travel a lot and wear expensive clothes and fine restaurants. Nobody knows where she got the money. Even her best friend, a woman named Carrie Weaver, didn't know where she got this money from. But that Friday, she stays at her dressmaker's house till 11 o'clock at night to get what they called a shirtwaist, but it was really a blouse. Today, the dressmaker's saying, I'll give it to you tomorrow. And he was going, no, I want to wear it this weekend. I'm going to Lake George. She didn't go to Lake George. She went to Schenectady with her aunt, who supposedly talked her out of going to Lake George. Well, why was she so intent on looking so nice to go to Lake George? And why did she not go to Lake George? So she goes to Lake George that weekend, which is July 4th weekend. The weekend in Schenectady, at the house of her cousin. Mark and I talked to the descendants of her cousin, who had died just before they found out about this. So they were kicking themselves because they couldn't go to their what do you call it, the opposite of an ancestor? They were the descendants, and they couldn't go to their relatives and say, what did you talk about with Hazel that weekend? What was on her mind? Because they just missed having that opportunity. So again, another frustration. But so Hazel and her aunt, her traveling companion, come back on Sunday of that weekend. On Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning, her employer says to her, will you do the family wash? Hazel goes, no. Which I respect, and walked off and said, not only that, but I'm quitting, and walked off the job. And nobody expected this. It was a complete surprise. Why did she quit? Nobody knows. She didn't have a job. That morning, she goes from the house of her employer. She goes to see her aunt, who traveled with her on Schenectady, was a very close friend, 20 years older, a cantankerous, cranky woman. And tells her, according to her aunt, who was a habitual liar, tells her that she's going to see some friends across the river in a town called Waterville. No mention, according to the aunt, no mention that she had just quit her job. Her aunt doesn't say to her, it's 10:30 on a Monday morning. Why aren't you at the carry-house? None of that comes up, according to the aunt. Hazel says she's going to Waterville. Hazel never went to Waterville. So where did she go? So why did she quit? Where did she go? Where was she Monday? Where did she spend Monday night? Nobody ever came forward to say Hazel spent Monday night with me. To this day, nobody knows where she spent Monday night. Almost all of Tuesday, her whereabouts are unknown. At 7:30 on Tuesday night, she's seen on the road near the pond where she was eventually found by two men who happen to be going into town, one of whom becomes a leading suspect because he was known to be obsessed with Hazel Drew, and all sorts of strange things going on with this guy. But so how did she get to Teal's? How did she get to that road? She had left her suitcase at Union Station in Troy. How was she planning to get back to Troy? Because she had no belongings with her. How was she planning to get back? What was she, not only how did she get there, but why did she go there? None of these questions were ever known. I mean, there were so many unknown mysteries that were never solved that really makes you wonder about the the quality or the intent of the investigation. And that's where I think Mark and I really latched onto. There has to be something going on here. And I think that what we established was that there was, and Troy, which is where Hazel lived and worked, was a notoriously corrupt city, a very prosperous, very lot of famous things happened in Troy that you wouldn't know about, like commercial, lots of shopping. It was on the Hudson's. There was a lot of port area. It turned out, and weirdly, this one town produced all these very powerful politicians. A guy like Frank Black, who went on to be governor of New York, and Ed Murphy, who was like a notorious. These guys were notoriously corrupt politicians, and they controlled everything. I mean, they controlled everything. Murphy was a Democrat, and Black was a Republican. And there was a guy we found out named Bat Shea in 1896, a Democrat who was stuffing ballots in the 1896 election, an Irish Catholic Democrat who American Protective Association, which was almost like the Ku Klux Klan. And they would meet, they virulently anti-Catholic. They had this oath, like that if you read it, you wouldn't believe it, the things that they were saying about Catholics. And they didn't want these, they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Republicans. And they were fearful of these Irish Catholic Democrats coming into Detroit. Now, admittedly, Bat Shea was stuffing ballots. There's no question about that. But these APA guys confront Shea on election night in 1896. And somehow a melee breaks out and a gun gets pulled out. And one of these APA guys, Robert Ross, gets shot and killed. He dies. Bat Shea is eventually execution. Bat Shea's friend confessed to that killing, but it was Bat Shea who was killed. And the judge knew that he confessed, and nobody knew that he confessed. Frank Black, the Republican, was the one who spearheaded the prosecution of Bat Shea. Frank Black was a Republican, Bat Shea was a Democrat. Frank Black will become governor of New York. We eventually come to the conclusion that Troy, being as corrupt as it was, politically speaking, influence that the parties had, played a huge role in Hazel's investigation, which is the long way of answering your question.
No, thank you. So tell me a little bit more about what role each of you played in putting this investigation together. Were you kind of bouncing ideas back and forth? Did you have very strongly delineated roles? What was that process like? And feel free to rib each other a little bit if you like.
Mark, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, David and I just met, I think, as we mentioned, or he mentioned in the intro, kind of over this project. He just called me one day or emailed me or something. So that's how we met, but that was a long time ago, 7 years ago or so now. So yeah, we became good friends over this. I think, we did not expect it would take 7 years. It just kind of like, there's so many different rabbit holes when it was, just briefly, I was talking earlier about, we found all the newspapers, and that was kind of like the first phase, putting that together, the 2.5 weeks of the failed investigation. So one of the reasons it took 7 years was that took a long time just to get all the contradictions and everything laid down. And then you have to deal with the fact that they, still didn't solve it. And that's what we wanted to do. So then you just start looking at all the different areas that, were seemingly overlooked or, easily explained away. And there's just a lot of rabbit holes there. So that's part of the reason it took so long. But what I was saying, over the period, the first few years, we were, not writing hardly at all. It was just researching, and it was kind of just open, whatever you were interested in. David did a ton of research and reading on the history, on the city of Troy and the history, and read several books on that. So we would just get into different areas that interested us. And that was really good. It was, I think, you want to talk about ribbing each other. I guess after years of doing that, and it was just kind of like harmonious. We just meet up every couple months, go meet, interview people. It was like just fun. And then we had to we got a deal, and now it's time to start drafting things. And if you remember, David, I think our first drafts, we each went off to write a chapter. I'm sure you were done way before me. But when we came back, they're just completely, a different approach really to what the book, there were just completely different ways you could tell the story, and you can tell it all kinds of different ways. And we explored a lot of those. At one point we were considering, or somebody was suggesting, it was one of those where we're part of the story, uncovering it. But I think in the end, we felt the story itself was really strong. And we were going to do something with a documentary, which may still happen, but we felt the story pretty much stood on its own, in a similar way that we don't mention Twin Peaks in the main text. It's mentioned in the intro, and we're lucky Mark Frost did the forward for us. So Twin Peaks is mentioned, I think, there as well. But the story really stood on its own. So I think I've wandered a bit. I'm not sure what the question was, or if it's David's turn to take over there. What was the question again, maybe?
Well, I think it was about how we delineated our responsibilities. Responsibilities, yeah.
Take some shots, David.
Yeah. So was interesting about collaborating, especially on something like this, is that it's so open to interpretation. Is we had, since you want us to rib each other, I'll get right to the heart of it. We had some, interesting disagreements that we had to resolve, and it was really hard for me to convince Mark that I was constantly right. It was really difficult. But one of them was about who Hazel was and how much, let me just say who Hazel was, and the other one that was really big was the head investigator was a guy named Jarvis O'Brien, who I think Mark became obsessed with at one point. Mark, is that a fair statement? I think Mark has a picture of Jarvis O'Brien in his room right now. I'm just kidding, Mark. But I was much being the sort of person who distrusts authority as much as I do. So I was kind of didn't like Jarvis O'Brien at all. And I thought that I thought the investigation was a joke. And Jarvis O'Brien headed the investigation. So to me, to be reductivist about it, there's two explanations for that. One is that Jarvis O'Brien is a complete idiot.
You've shown the picture of Jarvis O'Brien, yeah.
What is that? You see his mustache? This guy is like a complete showman. Let's be honest. All pizzazz. And one is that Jarvis O'Brien was either a complete idiot and didn't know what was going on, or two is that he knew what was going on and let it happen. So it's either an idiot or corrupt. And I'm going to Mark what is the third? What am I not seeing here? And I think Mark, and I'm sure Mark will have an opportunity to tell me I'm ridiculously off base here, but it had to be one of those two. So I thought Jarvis O'Brien was, and plus, he's a politician. You run for district attorney. He ran for mayor. He was deeply, deeply embedded in the Republican Party. This guy was no saint, to put it colloquially. I just never trusted him or the investigation. And I think Mark and I differed there. I would say that Mark's background is a consultant and a podcaster, a storyteller, and he's really, really good at research, and he handled a lot of that research on our behalf, especially stuff he tracked down some amazing stuff in terms of there were so many inconsistencies. One thing, my wife works for the press, so she hates it when I say this, but basically don't trust anything you ever read in the press. They were you read 10 versions of everything. And the other thing, again, if any of you are ever interested in writing history, never trust anything that you read as being accurate. Always track it down. Don't trust secondary sources. Don't be responsible for furthering false information. either track it down and correct it, or say that, there's 8 different explanations for this, and I couldn't tell you which one's true because I don't know. But Mark was great at tracking things down. And I think my interest in research tends to be more story driven. My background is I was a journalist for a lot of years, and then I was a TV curator or a historian at the Paley Center for Media, and I'm interested in sort of stories. So I would like read about this woman named Killian who lived in Troy and got killed shortly before Hazel, and I would just get carried away with that, and then I'd have to say to myself, does this really have anything to do with Hazel, or should I put this in? And it turned out that, guess what? Jarvis O'Brien was involved in that case as well. So I was able to get it in. But and then there was somebody called like the veiled murderess. Has anybody heard of this person? She wore a veil through her entire trial, and she was rumored to be married to like some duke in Britain or something, and they called her the veiled murderess. I mean, how can you resist a story like that, whether it has anything to do with the book or not? You got to get it in there, and so that was my weakness. I just kind of like, could go on and on and on about these incredible stories. Mark, do you want to tell me that I'm?
Yeah, I'll do a quick rebuttal. It's fun to talk about our differences because we actually agreed on like so much. I think we both had a pretty open mind about most things. Going in, like we didn't really have a lot of theories or pet theories, and we just organically evolved what we feel like the solution was. So just to take a step back on the whole Jarvis O'Brien, because that was probably our biggest disagreement. Just right from the get-go, David's like, this guy's crooked, he's a bum. So I did I probably could have written a book on him with the amount of research I pulled on him, and there is like a chapter that kind of covers him, but I don't want to get into all the specific defenses of his life story. But I will say, I think what happened there from my perspective is at some point we both did agree, and one of our co-conspirators here, I should mention, up in Sand Lake, Mark Marshall, who did a ton of research on this. I mean, this guy would just send us emails that would take a week to read with his thoughts, and he became obsessed with the case, probably more so than us. But I think him and actually David earlier on than I kind of clicked to it. Maybe David's a natural paranoia, but they were talking about maybe the investigation was in on it in some sense, and I was like, you guys are just pulling at straws. There's nothing there. Really what started that was the fact that Hazel worked for 3 different politicians in her 4 or 5 years there in her teenage years. She lived with them, lived with their families, very prominent. 2 of them ran for mayor of Troy. One was a city treasurer while Hazel worked for him. So that's, I think, where they got the initial thing, and none of that stuff was in any of the newspapers that we did the research on. They didn't look into these guys at all. So they were out looking at the, kind of the country bumpkins, and the employers where she lived and spent her whole life. They just kind of got mentioned in the paper, Hazel was a good girl. So we started looking into them, and you just start seeing connections between different casts of characters, and the cast of characters kept growing. And you find out this guy has a criminal record and so forth. So that's where that started. And we did, small spoiler, I think most people there have not read this, maybe some have, but we did kind of look at the investigation being flawed, and that's definitely a part of our proposed solution. But there's also such thing as a nuance, and in all my digging around, I think I made a fairly good case that if something may have been going on, that it may have been certain other parties. And I don't know how much of my proof David got edited out of the final version of the book, but you can read it for yourself to see what you think. It would be really interesting to hear people's opinion on Jarvis O'Brien, because we had to write this book together. Most of the stuff we agreed upon, we argued over wording or stupid stuff like that. But who could have been and kind of is maybe in a way the protagonist of this book, is we completely disagreed upon. So we had to kind of like rate him neutrally and what we knew about him on the record, kind of, and leave it up to, I've seen reviews, you know, on the internet about him being a crook. And I'm like, what? You guys didn't, you didn't pick up on the nuance. And the last thing I would say about the different roles we had, yeah, David definitely had the background as a journalist, and he helped just kind of move things forward and pepper things up. How I originally saw, when I said we each had different drafts, his was much more like that, like factually based and kind of getting everything down on the record. And mine was like, my first draft was like, you know, a probably not very good, but first draft of a novel of some sort, you know, just kind of like describing Hazel walking up the murky woods and all that. So that's where we looked at each other and said, what are we, and it took a while to figure it out. And the book really is kind of a hybrid of that. I think we both came to see the strengths of the other's vision, but it took a while. At some points, I think we even started to champion the other side that we had originally came upon. But one thing I really did enjoy doing, I think more than David, is this book is something that's coined. It's called creative nonfiction, and that everything is thoroughly fact-checked to the best of our ability. But because we thought it was such a great story, I mean, this is something, if you haven't read it, it's very cinematic, and like I keep seeing it as a 13 episode with the twists and turns, you know, on HBO or AMC or something like that. But if you, I just lost my big finale. I'm so sorry. What was I saying, David? Refresh me again. It's been a long day. I'm sorry.
You're talking about creative nonfiction is what you're talking about.
I was just going off on how I enjoyed that part. So you'll read along, and we'll kind of be telling an aspect of the case or the investigation. And wherever we found, because we kind of got to know these characters just through the research and talking to their family and so forth. And there's, I think, a strength of the book is the characters. You know, her Aunt Minnie is this old busybody who knew Hazel better than anybody, but wasn't saying anything. Her uncle, Will Taylor, lived out. His farm is less than a mile away from where the pond where Hazel's body was found. And he's this cranky old, kind of a-hole who doesn't help the investigation. And Frank Smith is this described as kind of the village idiot in the parlance of the time. Probably had, mental challenges, God bless him, but he kind of had a crush on Hazel. So there's all these great archetypes in the story, like Twin Peaks, if you're familiar with it. And I think it's just the setting, that small town setting. A murder happens, and that's what started Twin Peaks, and that's what is the starting point for this. But then you start to see all these. One thing we would say about Hazel, David and I disagreed on her a little bit because you're trying to reconstitute a human being, which is impossible. But one thing, I'm sorry, I lost it again. I need a glass of water. Go on, Dave.
Can I just follow up on this quickly on this, Mark? Are you still going, Mark, or what? So this Mark Marshall, who Mark Givens mentioned as somebody who was like basically our boots on the ground and up there, we started calling him the detective. He's a retired school messenger who lives on grounds where the church that Hazel's family went to are still there. The foundation of it is still there. And he started to think that Hazel was talking to him in visions and things like that. And so he was really helpful. But we almost, I say that unironically. What's really the story, where I'm going with this is that, I don't know, Troy had a very active and very famous I don't know if you've heard of a world famous madam by the name of Mame Faye. I don't know if that means anything to you, but she set up these houses of sex workers, to use the modern parlance, a block away from the police station. And the police would stand guard over the house, and she would have her employees come out and give them cups of hot coffee so they wouldn't get cold. So that's the way Troy was. But it was right near the train station. It was right in an area where Hazel worked during one stretch of her career. And she spent a lot of time at the train station. So, of course, we're looking into the possibility, because Hazel also was missing on Monday night. Did she stay at one of these? So we're looking into every possibility, one of which is that she was involved in this red light district in some way, which didn't happen. But because, there was also a rumor that she at one point was pregnant, and because she had gone out to the woods to her uncle's house for like 3 weeks in winter and had a mysterious illness that nobody knew what the cause was, and no doctor was called supposedly, and all this. So there were secrets to Hazel, no doubt about that, but not that she was involved in the red light district. But anyway, this is all about Mark Marshall, because at one point they found in Hazel's trunk the name and phone number of a train conductor in New York named John Magner. And they went to talk to this guy, and this guy says, the cops went to talk to him, and he says, I have no idea. I never met Hazel Drew, but I never knew who she was before I read her name in the paper, and I don't know why she had my name in her thing. So then they find out from some people at the train station that John Magner was talking to a woman regularly at the lunch counter in the train station at a woman who looked like Hazel Drew, who fit Hazel's description. So then they go back to Magner and they say, these witnesses are saying that you're there almost every day talking to this woman. It turns out this woman is not Hazel, supposedly, but a woman named Anna LaBelle. So Mark Marshall, being the researcher that he is, tries to find everything he can about Anna LaBelle. It turns out that there is an Anna LaBelle living in Troy at the same time who was, like Mame Faye, a madam. And now we're thinking, wait a second, maybe we were wrong in thinking that Hazel had nothing to do with it. This woman claimed that the only way she knew this Anna LaBelle, who John Magner was talking to, claimed that she only knew Hazel because Hazel would shop at the store where she worked. Then we do some research into the sex worker, Anna LaBelle, and it turns out that she left in her entire estate to a man named Stuart Jones. And what was Stuart Jones? So Stuart Jones was a Republican, Mark was a Republican, and was a district attorney, or became district attorney. Eventually, in fact, beat out Jarvis O'Brien for the job, but another deeply entrenched Republican. So you have a sex worker leaving like $20,000, her estate, when she died, to a powerful Troy lawyer who eventually became district attorney and maybe Hazel Drew's friend. And we were so excited, I could not tell you. We were over the moon. And then, just to tell you what the experience of writing and researching this book was like, it turned out that there were two Anna LaBelles living in Troy at the same time, and that our Anna LaBelle was not the same as that Anna LaBelle. And we were just devastated, So, but Mark was the one basically behind that.
Was David, that was you and Mark, basically, right? I was never really on that Anna LaBelle train.
I was deeply into that,
yeah. So before we throw it to our wonderful audience for a Q&A moment here, what are some of the highlights that you want readers to really take away from? You've kind of given us a few highlights so far, but what are some of the shining moments that you want readers to really take away from this book?
Mark?
Well, one thing we've done a few of these events, some in person and some like this. This is our first kind of hybrid. But one thing we don't really ever get a chance to talk about is the solution chapter. I talked a bit about our research process, where the first, not half, but the first phase, we're looking at the investigation and trying to reconstitute that. And that's really the bulk of the book, even though it wasn't necessarily the bulk of the research. A lot of it was in that final chapter or two, which we want you to read the book and not be spoiled, so we can't really discuss all that. But it's got sex and politics and corruption and everything in there. So that's a highlight for me, but it is frustrating that we can't really get into it too much. And we've debated that, at what point are we allowed to, but I think we more want people to get the story and experience it for themselves, because it's laid out like that. The clues are in there if you're reading it. It's a story, but you're following the investigation just like we did in a way. We just put it all out there for you already. And there is a very big, thing that kind of got overlooked, and it's right there in chapter. But you got to read that, and we don't talk about that much either, I guess, because that will give it away. But I guess that would be the highlight. Another, very quickly, that we haven't touched upon. We did talk. There is a chapter that's basically about we talked about the press and the role of newspapers and so forth. And there's a chapter that's, pretty much on that. I forget, it uses some examples, but then we get into the background of the media and so forth. And I think we both really liked one of the characters we encountered is this guy named Will Clemens, who fraudulently claimed he was Mark Twain's nephew or cousin. He kept changing it, and Mark Twain always denied it. But he's like this real character who just he built himself as the world's greatest criminologist. He's a reporter, but he writes short stories, and he's a detective and does all this stuff. But about a week or so, he appears on the scene, and at first he somehow inveigles his way into the investigation, so that the first reports of him are like from another newspaper saying, "Oh, world famous criminologist is helping the investigation." And then 2 or 3 days later, when he finally publishes his stuff, he's completely slamming the investigation for being incompetent. And him and Jarvis O'Brien go back and forth and are battling. But he's like this big showman. He's definitely like just kind of a self-centered showman on one sense, but he also does bring up some interesting theories and some evidence that just isn't reported elsewhere, that you have to look at, and then you have to like look at again with a critical eye, and some of it you throw away, but some of it he wouldn't like just flat out lie, but he would just get caught up in the story and kind of embellish things more than anything. But he's a really interesting character as well, and he's just kind of, and then he heads out. The whole thing lasted about 2.5 weeks, and he heads out 3 or 4 days before everybody else finally gives up on the case. At the grand finale, they have an inquest near the end of the month, the last 2 days. And that's kind of just bringing all the old suspects and witnesses that they had before, and nothing really came of it. But Clemens he's gone long before then, and he's off to the next case that he's claiming to solve, some spy case or something. So just an interesting character. And again, when we spot characters like that, those are the ones who get the little creative nonfiction scenes. So you're kind of in a novel all of a sudden. And what you'll be seeing is, a scene that really happened. Like, we know Clemens confronted O'Brien at his office, but we just kind of take whatever dialogue we have and just build a scene out of it, because it's just, kind of helps the story along. So that's my highlights.
So I would just say that I think it does work as a whodunit, as Mark said very well. And we throw in a lot of history, politics, the press. But I think, to me, the kind of overriding thing about this is that, it's such a different time. It's like 114 years ago. We walk through these places and we walk through these woods and try to imagine what it was like in 1908. We walked through Sand Lake and tried to immerse ourselves in and read all the stuff, and we had these images in our head. It was such a different place. It was so much fun, particularly with everything that was going on in the country, with like the storming of the Capitol and everything. But it was so nice to get away from that. My point is that it was so different, yet in some very important ways, it's no different at all. Because I think that the underlying point of this story, and we would get people who say, "Why can't you just leave Hazel alone?" And when you read our what we write at the end, I mean, we think the exact opposite. We think Hazel's been forgotten, and we think she should be remembered, because I think this is really, above everything else, a story of how of how trying to think of the right way of wording this, of how privilege lets you get away with so much, and how unjust our system is, and how sort of weighted it is in terms of people who come from these privileged backgrounds. And Hazel was a woman at a time where women were marginalized. We couldn't even find women's name in the city directories. There were Mrs. So-and-so. She's a woman. She was not a wealthy woman. She was basically a housekeeper for wealthy people, and was paid nothing. And I believe firmly that her murder, if she had been a white male of some wealth and some privilege, her murder would have been solved. And I just don't know how far we've come in 114 years from that place. So that, to me, is the lesson of Hazel, and that's why this book is important. I mean, it works as a whodunit and everything, but I think there is that sort of message to it, and that's kind of what I'm most proud of.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let's turn it to you all for some questions if you have some.
Hi. In the very early 60s, William Kunstler, the attorney, the famous radical attorney, he wrote a book called The Minister and the Choir Singer. It was about a murder of a woman in upstate New York. And it was also unsolved. And he produced his own solution. And I was just wondering if you knew about that book and if it gave you courage to go on with doing a book about an unsolved murder.
I wish I did know about that book, and I did not. But like I said, I thought that whole response by the publishing companies, considering things like Black Dahlia and Jack the Ripper, and now you're telling me on another example, is just, you sometimes just wonder what they're thinking. So, I mean, if I were Stephen King, they wouldn't have come back to me and said, we're not going to publish your book because the murder's not solved, So, but thank you for telling me that. It's still in print?
Oh, no, it's out of print. But again, like we were talking earlier, thrift books and or whatever.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not familiar with it either, but I think that also gets back to the point that I feel like, doing these events and talking to people, it kind of became apparent, like, true crime is the big thing that sells and has all the podcasts and everything, and that's what we're labeled under. But there's a bit of a distinction to me in between true crime and like a historical mystery like that. Whereas it seems like in true crime, often it's solved and you're just kind of going through the gory details. Often the focus is on the killer, getting in the head of the killer. If it's Jack the Ripper, you don't know who it is, but you're still trying to figure that out. Ours, to a large degree, is focused on the victim of Hazel, because that's who we know, and to try and solve it, we had to just find out as much about Hazel as we could. So even when we're looking at politician X who worked with her employer, it's because of the possible connection to Hazel. So yeah, and it's like we said, that's something we probably kind of disagree about if we wrote a paragraph about who is Hazel Drew. But I think that's because she was, I make this point as well, everyone's nuanced, and she's a real person. She's not a character. So I think that's part of it too.
Did you get any direction on Hazel's past, her family, acquaintances from before she moved to New York?
From her family, we talked to descendants of hers, and there was one of the people who said leave her alone was that. But other people, I mean, we came so close to getting a family photo of her, but in the end they decided not to give it to us. But a lot of people who we had a great, we also did talk to people in her family. Hazel obviously had no children because she never got married, but none of her brothers and sisters had biological children either. So, but there were other descendants of hers, and one of them had done a family genealogy, and that person was so helpful. She told us, Mark had mentioned this, the aunt, Minnie Taylor, who was her really close friend and like 30 years, and this cantankerous woman, but we found out so much about her because this woman who kept the genealogy was actually like really young when Minnie was still alive. And she told us things like everybody hated when Minnie came over because she was like always butting into the family business. I mean, we all know somebody like that, right? But the parents used to tell the kids, whatever you do, don't lose a game of dominoes to Aunt Minnie. Like Minnie would freak out if one of these kids beat her. So it was, we got a lot of help and we got some resistance.
Like old friends, old boyfriends.
Nobody there was nobody, we could find nobody around who knew Hazel, who knew Hazel. And one of the interesting things about her boyfriends were her best friend, Carrie Weaver, said she had no boyfriends. Relatives of hers said she had no boyfriends, and yet she had a trunk full of letters from male admirers. And including, this guy, John Magner, the conductor, like what exactly was their relationship? Why would his name and number have been in her trunk? So they never really actually established who her boyfriends were or that she actually even had any. So there was a lot of, it was really hard to research this.
Yeah,
case.
it was,
but they were signed by their initials only. They didn't, or anonymous. They didn't sign their names, oddly enough.
Oh, gosh.
What were you going to say, Mark?
I was just going back to had we talked to anyone, it was kind of we just kind of missed it because you think it's 110 years ago. So no one is alive then. Like we talked to some very elderly people and they would remember their parents kind of talking about a story. It's kind of as close as we got. Like the titular Teal's Pond, we talked to the Teals, 3 of them who were great grandchildren of the farmer who found it. So they, had heard some stories, but they were trying to remember like family lore at this point, and they're in their 70s or 80s at that point. So we kind of just missed it. And what all those people were able to provide though were in their family stories and stuff is like David was talking about. Minnie was kind of some extra character that the newspapers or just straight up research wouldn't provide, but no real direct witnesses like the descendants of Hazel's cousins that were actually like pretty much looking into this case themselves. Their great grand whoever, they knew her, but she had that's who Hazel went to visit the weekend before. I don't know if David mentioned that. So they were like really bummed that that's the other thing. Over time, this had really faded into obscurity. So it was really us, I think, with the Twin Peaks connection that kind of brought this back up. But for years, it had devolved into like a ghost story. Like no one remembered the facts at all. They just remembered some dead girl at the pond. So in terms of like the straight up research about what happened then, we more relied on newspapers and historical documents. One other quick thing I don't think I mentioned that's just amazing and that you couldn't have done like so much of this 10, 15 years ago even is like ancestry.com. I had like dozens of family trees just of all the people, involved in the case. So you can see who their brothers and sisters were and what they were up to. And it was invaluable going up there. We probably went up there a dozen times for the roundtables and talking to people and descendants and so forth. But you can do a lot online these days. It's pretty amazing.
Speaking of that, descendant of Teal, the guy who owned the land where the pond was. I mean, to give you an idea of the kind of information that they passed along, like this guy said, his father had told him, and nobody ostensibly knew who the killer was, and if they did, they kept it secret. But this guy, whose father was a farmer who owned that land, told his son that 3 people were involved in the murder. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was a lawyer, an undertaker, and I forget what the third one was.
Doctor.
And like, that's what somebody who was around during that time passed down. And I mean, we did everything we could to track that down, but so I think a lot of I think there were rumors that you had to sift through, and like I said, it was a really hard thing to research, but it was fun. You know, it was really fun.
We have time for one more question.
Is there another? So, I haven't heard much about a genre, this genre of historical nonfiction as compared to historical fiction.
Right.
I mean, creative nonfiction versus historical fiction.
Right.
Do you think that this genre is going to start taking off, given?
I think there are examples maybe of this. I mean, what's really interesting about that was, I resisted that genre completely, being a journalist, and we were working with this company called Metabook at the time, which had purchased our rights and then eventually sub-licensed it out. But he would say to me, like, that whole, if you've read the book, for those of you who had that whole first beginning of chapter 1, where Hazel is at the pond, like wondering what she's doing there, and that's like, I mean, we never talked to Hazel. I mean, they told us to put that in, and I'm going like, are you sure you want us to put that in? I think there are other examples of this, and I was very uncomfortable with it at first, but I'm okay with it now. I'm fine with it. I think it makes the book read better. We didn't, I think the book is true in every way, but I think that remember when Oliver Stone did JFK? Yeah. Remember how much attention there was to that kind of thing? You're shaking your head, you didn't like that? He took liberties way out there.
Really
yeah.
big liberties.
Yeah.
People believe that it's fact.
Right, and I think where we're speculating is in the last chapter, and we indicate that we're speculating. So I think that there's always going to be resistance to it, and I think that, but I think it's going to. I mean, our publisher and our agent told us to do it, so there's definitely a sentiment out there in favor of it. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm sorry.
They have Inventing Anna, that's all over Netflix, which is completely true, except for the parts that are.
Oh, it's done on TV shows all the time, right? I mean, The Dropout is doing it, and the Inventing Anna is doing it. It's done.
So you're right there. When it's popular.
Yeah. That's a great point. It's absolutely true. Would you be watching it if it wasn't? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as they stayed up front what they're doing, then I think that you're okay.
Yeah.
But as long as you don't like say that, who did he think killed? Yeah. There's a really good book about that, by the way, called The Road to Dallas, which is very good.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here this evening. All right, I'm going to turn the camera around so you can see folks.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
And if you bought your book ahead of time on Eventbrite, just let me know and I'll find your name for you. I'll grab a pen.
Hey, real people. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shady.
Hi, Mark.
All right, take care.
You're in Philadelphia, right?
Yep.
Promise?
Oh, yeah. When is that?
April 8th, I think, or thereabouts.
Yeah. We were going to go anyway for David Tennant, so yep.
What'd you say?
I was planning on going to that anyway, actually.
Okay, good.
But yep, I'll talk to you.
Okay.
All right, see you later. Bye.
Signed inside downstairs.
Did you sign autograph list?
You already have the book. You don't have the book? You didn't buy the book?
I don't know. Yes. Okay, I'll just pay for it downstairs then if you don't want.
No, of course I'll sign it.